We are live. Welcome, everyone. I can see some folks getting joined into our Zoom session here. So thank you so much for getting logged in. We'll just give you a few seconds to get in here into Zoom. We do have a pretty large audience. And again, welcome. Thanks so much for joining. So we'll be broadcasting on our Facebook page and spread the word. Well, great. Well, thank you so much for joining today's session. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to this Diverse Talk Live, Survival Strategies for BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and/or People of Color, Higher Ed Administrators. All participants are currently in a listen-only mode. After the conversation, we will have a Q&A session. You can feel free to type your questions in the Q&A panel that can be found in your Zoom window. Participants can only see their own questions. And of course, for any technical assistance, you can also use that Q&A feature to reach me. We are recording today's sessions and it will be on Facebook Live. You will also receive a link to the recording after the session. And now it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Jamal Watson. Welcome, Dr. Watson. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and good afternoon. So excited to be here and to moderate this important conversation with some of our leading scholars and thinkers. And so again, very, very excited about it. While a considerable amount of attention has been focused on survival strategies for BIPOC students and faculty, we wanted to take a closer look at some of the challenges that higher education administrators face. This is an untapped area amid broader conversations about diversity and higher ed. It is not lost on me that this discussion is taking place during Women's History Month. And so I want to acknowledge the many ways in which so many women of color in particular are excluded and deemed invisible within the ranks of higher education. We will have an interactive conversation today. So I want to invite you to put your question in the Q&A box below, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. My job is simply to facilitate the conversation and make it as engaging and conversational and interactive as possible. So I want to introduce our colleagues joining us today, and I'll ask that they turn on the camera once I do so, and that is so that we can begin this conversation. First, we have Dr. Kalila L. Brown-Dean, who's the Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs and a Professor of Political Science at Quinnipiac University. Welcome, Dr. Brown-Dean. We next have Dr. Renee White, who is the Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs at the New School. Welcome. And finally, we have Dr. Jessica Laveriga Monforti. I hope I got that right. She helped me out a little bit earlier, who's the Vice Provost and Accreditation Liaison Officer at California State University, Channel Islands. So welcome to you all. Glad to have you here. I want to start off the conversation with talking broadly about what are some of the challenges facing the faculty of color within the academy. What are you seeing? What are you hearing? What are you experiencing? So maybe we'll go with you first, Provost White.
I had a feeling you were going to come to me first. So first of all, I'm just really, so delighted to be here and to be here with two incredible colleagues and hosted by you. So first of all, thank you for that. And I would say that, some of the challenges that I think faculty of color are facing, there are a number of different ways to approach this. I think one of the things is often within our institutions, really being expected to do a certain kind of care work, care work with our students. But I would also say the sort of default assumption, that faculty of color are responsible for addressing anything related to our identities in terms of, structural change, policy implementation, or any other kinds of intervention. And then another piece that I think is also a challenge, or can be a challenge, is really sort of the sort of politics around our scholarship and the ways in which our scholarship can be perceived, whether or not we're studying a subject matter that's related to our own histories and our backgrounds, that our identities oftentimes calls into question the intellectual and academic legitimacy of the work that we do. And institutions really have to figure out how to address that. So those are a few of the things that I think have been and continue to be, significant challenges that we face in the academy.
Thank you so much. Kalila?
Thank you, Jamal. And again, I want to echo Renee's comments. Thank you for the opportunity for us to gather and for me to learn from these two dynamic leaders. I want to name very clearly where we are in this moment of massive political upheaval, massive social and economic upheaval, massive health inequalities that have manifested in multiple ways, particularly around mental health and mental well-being. Add that layer onto the changes that are happening across higher education, and we know that people who are last in the door, so to speak, are often most vulnerable. So to think about faculty of color, students of color, higher ed leaders of color, to be in a position where they are at once invisible and hyper visible because of these broader changes, that is the piece of it that makes it so difficult. So that it's not just leading in higher education as a challenge, but leading as a person of color during all of these changes that you are often looked to fix, and perhaps not really listen to say, that's beyond my lane. So I think that's the context and the landscape that we are all surviving, and also figuring out what it means to be in higher education.
No, I like that. And I'm glad that you framed it in that way, because I think that gives us a lot to really dissect over the next hour. Jessica?
Well, I can just say great minds think alike. Renee and Kalila's comments, I think, are right on target, and I'm really honored to be here with these two amazing women today. Thank you for the invitation. Y bienvenidos a todos. I want to say that I have been framing this for myself, this moment in time, as fighting a triple pandemic. And I think Kalila laid it out quite well. I want to say that things are not more on our plate, they are intensified on our plates. And I think that that is an important context for us. All of the underlying issues that were there before are still there, but they are heightened. They are heightened because all of us, including those of us who are supposed to be problem solvers right now, have limited bandwidth, because the major components of our society that allow us to do this work have failed. Schools are closing, children are sick, parents are ill. And so that clearly impacts all of our mental health. It means that everything goes to sort of DEFCON 1 immediately, rather than slowly ratcheting up. Everyone is reactive in the space. And then you add to that we are now in a time where filters on our communication would be so essential to keeping the so-called peace, and we're just not in a place to use them right now. And that includes in our classroom spaces. Just here locally, we've had a White Lives Matter protest just near our campus at the beginning of Black History Month. The list goes on. And so these aren't new challenges, but certainly the challenges are more intensified under these conditions.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm just curious to know personally what your individual journeys were like in terms of getting to administration, right? And what has that experience been like for you, kind of? And I imagine navigating the ranks of faculty to now be an administrator. Anyone want to hop in?
I mean, I'm happy to hop in there. Jessica and I were graduate students at The Ohio State University together, and our dear mentor was Dr. William E. Nelson Jr. And Dr. Nelson made it very clear that if your path into academia is the one that you're going to take, you have to understand that the stakes are always incredibly high. And it seemed really unfair as a graduate student to hear someone say that to us, because we always felt like he was doubting us, like we weren't good enough, but it really was preparation. I went into higher education to be a professor with all of these ideas of what that path would look like. You do your work, you keep your head down, and then you advance and promote, and quickly realize that life doesn't work like that. And higher education life does not work like that at all. I became a full professor in political science last year. And as we know, women, particularly women of color, are very underrepresented at the full professor rank. And as I moved toward that, I asked myself, what do I want this next stage of my career to be? I could sit back and complain about the things that I saw, or I could jump into it and try to make a change. So started doing some university level administrative work in a part-time capacity, continuing as full-time professor. And so I'm the newbie of this bunch. I'm about 8 months into my role. And I'll also mention that it is an inaugural role. So it is the first time our university has had someone in place overseeing faculty affairs.
Wow. Jessica?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I hold a job right now that when I was 18, I didn't know existed, nor did I care to know it existed. Frankly, I was just happy to be in college at that time. I think like so many first-gen Pell eligible students whose parents just want them to have a job they understand. I wanted to be an attorney and quickly learned that was not the choice for me. I think that is the burden many political scientists carry. We were all supposed to be attorneys at some point. But I think that what drove me into this particular direction was not necessarily a plan that said, I want to become an administrator, but that desire that also led me to want to be an attorney, which is I wanted to see improvements for my community. I wanted to be a part of the solution rather than a part of the problem. And I think that early on, as actually a junior faculty member at the University of Texas Pan American, I was sort of put in a position of leadership because my parents raised me to not be quiet, and Kalila will laugh at that. But I wanted to speak out. I was at an HSI where 90% of the students were Latino, and I was the only Latina political scientist. I was the only Latina that was elected to faculty governance positions from my area, et cetera. And then doors started to open. Doors that I didn't anticipate would open started to open. And that doesn't mean you say yes to every single one of those. But I do think you have to consider what it would be like. What does it look like to the students who are watching you, those undergraduate and graduate students? What does it mean for your peers? To this day, my grandmother thinks that because I have a PhD in political science, it means I'm going to be president of the United States. She has no clue what a provost is, bless her. But what I can say is, and I think this is part of the things that keep me grounded through these very difficult times, is I remember my why am I here? And I remember my who am I here for? Mm-hmm. And so this is not something for me that I can just put aside. This isn't just work, right? For me, this is being really called to do this kind of work inside an institution that is very difficult to change.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing. Renee?
I think my story has some elements that are similar to both Jessica and Kalila. And, I never would have believed that I would be in an academic leadership role like this, like ever. And, that was not my plan, that was not my path. I, was so passionate and happy as a faculty member in sociology and Black studies and as a Black feminist scholar. And, my whole pathway through being an undergrad and a grad student, there were sort of the seeds, they were always there, but, I had to really kind of go back to connect all of them. And I think, some of the formative experiences that I had as a graduate student in particular, I think really helped inform the way that I've tried to be as a faculty member and now in my administrative role. Because as a grad student, I was facing a circumstance where my colleagues and I, my fellow grad students of color and I, had to create space for ourselves at an institution that could be inhospitable depending on what program you were in. And so we created our own sort of intellectual and social and political space where we were doing work in community with our community partners, where we were supporting each other in our own research to get us through, to make sure that we graduated. And that kind of notion of, how can you make change in a space where you may or may not be welcome? And, how do you consider your mutual responsibility and connectivity to others, and how does that inform the decisions you want to make where you have agency, right? And so I think that really kind of connected in the ways that I would work in as a faculty member. And I was always doing service, and I was always doing things that had sort of community impact, institutional impact, asking questions about policy, but never thought of that as the pathway to an administrative role. And so when I was a faculty member, full professor at Fairfield University in Connecticut, really happy with my work. And I'm contacted by a search firm that says, you've been nominated for this deanship at Simmons College. And, my first thought was, well, you clearly have the wrong Renee White, because I'm not interested. I'm happy in my job. I'm not looking to do something different. And it really was conversation with my family, and particularly with my husband, and really and with my friends, where they said, you've been doing this kind of work, and this is an opportunity for you to maybe have an impact on institutions that you are limited in doing as a faculty member. And that was really the thing that kind of flipped the switch for me, and led me to really think about what it might mean to be in this kind of role, what kind of possible impact could I have, and how does it really allow me to tap into the things that I know I want to have be different for students as well as for faculty and staff.
Yeah, interesting. Well, we know that, and Diverse has written about this, other higher ed publications have written about this, that there seems to be more and more faculty of color, administrators of color leaving higher ed, right? And so I was wondering if you all could speak to that exodus that you're seeing. And I'm also thinking, Kalila, about what you talked about in terms of inspiring graduate students even to think about the possibilities of really, a life in the academy and what it means in terms of moving the needle, right? And helping to make progress, like Jessica mentioned as well. So could you all talk about what you're seeing in terms of this exodus that's happening across the country?
I don't think that our field is immune to the broader changes that we're seeing in jobs and industry, the great resignation overall. I think over this last 2 years, and to think that we're at the 2-year mark of being in this pandemic, over the last 2 years, people have had the time to step back and say, why am I doing what I'm doing? Why am I pouring into a space that doesn't acknowledge me or doesn't respect me? What is the kind of life that I want to live to feel fulfilled? And where do I want to be to bring my time, my talent, and my energy? And so we're seeing people make those kinds of choices and decisions, especially as many universities and other employers think about the return to not work, because we have all worked above and beyond over these last 2 years, but the return to the office or to campus or to space. The other piece of it, Jamal, I try to help people think about the benefit of some of the disruptions in our lives. We're at a moment where everybody wants to have someone who can check the box to say, look, we created a more diverse workforce, or we have someone in place who's thinking about these issues. So it can be a very lucrative and abundant time for people who 2 or 3 years ago, people were questioning their worth and their value. Doesn't mean that question has gone away. It just now means that more people of color have options and choice. And that's always a good thing, even though we know all options and choices are not equal.
No, that's very, very important. Others, Jessica?
Yeah, I wanted to add, I think we need to reframe the way we think about education and the role of educators, students, staff, administrators during this triple pandemic. I think we need to think of ourselves as essential workers. We are frontline workers. I cannot tell you the number of students, faculty, staff who have come and said, I am now caretaking for multiple members of my family. I have had loss in my family and I don't know how to come back to my pre-COVID life. Between just my husband and myself over the last 2 years, we have lost 9 family members to COVID. We have not been to a funeral. That is not strange when I talk, especially to my students of color. I think that when we reframe and think of ourselves as frontline workers and think about how we want to support the nurses and doctors in the hospitals and other healthcare workers, we don't apply that same logic to ourselves. And yet that has been our experience. And I think that would really help us think about what it is we need as next steps. We have not really had the luxury of stopping what we are doing. We have had to live in a constant state of flux. Pivot is now a 4-letter word on most college campuses and universities, right? Because we're pivoting online. Now we're pivoting to hybrid. Now we're pivoting back into person. And now we're pivoting again. And some people don't want to come back. And what do we do with that student who really literally can't even afford to return to campus? Housing security, food security, insecurity issues, these are all now a part of our daily experiences. And yet that acknowledgement has not followed because, well, this is education. We're all in an ivory tower. And that is not the reality that the vast majority of us are living in today.
No, that's important. And in addition to what you said, pivot, Kalila said grit is the new word as well. So certainly want to lift that up. Renee?
Honestly, I mean, I also think that this is generally a referendum on higher ed more broadly, that, the people's relationships to their colleges and universities has gone through a really profound transformation that I think started before the pandemic and then was exacerbated during the pandemic, where the sort of notion that, our identities are fully defined in relationship to our work as scholars and artists within higher ed, or the assumption that we're all in and that we're sort of 24/7 connected to our jobs. And I think that people are really providing, are creating strong boundaries about that and are saying, well, first of all, my labor isn't being valued in the way that I need it to be. These institutions, when we use the language of family or other sort of ways of characterizing, who we are within higher ed, and folks are saying, no, I'm an employee of you, an employer, and I provide a service that has value to it. And I'm also a valuable human being. And if all of those pieces aren't being realized within this particular job environment, I'm going to vote with my feet and go somewhere else if I can, right? And then there are the folks who can't, thinking about people who are in contingent labor positions as faculty. So I think that has happened. So there's a referendum on higher ed, which is how are we going to think about and approach what it means to be an employer, what it means to be an organization that has policies and practices that should reflect the rhetoric that we espouse. And people are calling us on it, and they're calling us on it because they should. And then on top of that, I think for faculty and staff of color and for grad students of color who are questioning whether or not they're going to stay and complete their programs, it's all bound up in all of these other things, So you were taking care of a family member and you were making a certain amount in your job that doesn't reflect the quality of your intellectual engagement. How are you going to survive? What are the decisions you're going to make? So I think there's a lot that's going on, right now that I think also speaks to why people are leaving. And on top of it, folks are tired. They're tired of, the 24/7 element of the work, a lot like what you were saying, Jessica. And I think, just the things that we are all facing in our personal lives and having to balance all of that, and something has to give, what makes sense to let go of if you can. And what do you need to hold close to you that makes sense and has value to you? So there's so much, I think, happening right now that it's a confluence of all of these industry kind of events in terms of higher ed. It's what's happening within, the economy, and it's also the political climate that we're in, that it's a lot to have to bear all of that and without something having to break.
So I'm wondering then, how do we shift the tide? How do we change course and kind of address some of those issues that you all have outlined as well?
Yeah, I think here is where leadership matters. And leadership isn't just having a title or a position. It is about being very determined to say that if we call ourselves a community, I kind of cringe when people talk about the family, because my family is my family, it's not my work. But if we are a community, and realizing that communities are made up of different spaces, different opportunities. If we call ourselves a community, then we have to lead to say that our community is in crisis. Our community is constantly navigating trauma, multiple traumas, and trauma that embeds itself into our spirit in ways that we don't even know sometimes. And the same ways that we always ask for grace for our students, we have to start extending that grace to ourselves and others that we work with. There's a question in the chat to you, Renee, about what leadership looks like and how different having a demographic of leadership at a university, how it can affect that. I'm at a university where our president is a woman, our provost is a woman, our associate provost is a woman, key members of the leadership team are women. What do you do with that position? To say it's not enough to just occupy space, but we have to affirm those spaces and understand that people take different paths in their careers and their lives. And instead of privileging one over another, how do we lead to create spaces of opportunity? That's where I think it matters for people who are in higher education, who are underrepresented and often feel the weight of being underrepresented. Because if either of the three of us mess up, it doesn't just reflect on us personally. It becomes, see, I told you so. That's why we shouldn't take this risk, or why we should stick to the status quo in leadership.
Yeah, being judged at the group level, rather individually, it has an impact for sure. Jessica?
Oh boy, the truth is there is no going back. There is no pre-COVID. There is no pre the marches around social injustice and police brutality. There is no going back. The question is, what do we do now? What have we adapted to over the course of these last 2 years that limit and hedge back on equity gaps for our faculty, staff, and students? It's about recentering. For me, this is a time to recenter, reground ourselves. And I think in terms of, building that pipeline, it is the mission that calls people, right, to do this work. This is not, please do not do this work if you are in it for the money, because there's none. Do not do it for the flexibility in your work schedule, because there is none. You're just always on call, especially in the days of smartphones, right? You do it if you have a true core belief that this work is important work. That doesn't mean that the money doesn't matter and the flexibility doesn't matter, but that can't be the only sort of motivating item for you. And I think in some ways, what we are seeing is people have figured out that there are other ways for them to feed into what is most important to them outside of higher education. I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I think it's time, frankly, to have some new people come into the fold, some old folks, and perhaps some new folks who maybe shouldn't have been there. Find another place to really live into and lean into their talents. I think that this is now a time to set what our priorities are, not just as individuals, but as institutions, as systems, as communities. And I say communities not in the family connotation, right? But as communities that have to collaborate, have to work together. one of the questions that I kept asking at a previous institution is, where is our floor? What are the minimums that we are willing to accept from people? And I think what we are hearing as people exit higher education and perhaps new people come in is they're no longer willing to accept the floor that has been set right now. So this is a time for us to level up. If we want to keep those good people and we think they belong to in this field to do this work, we have to change what we're doing. We are seeing, frankly, that students, our faculty, our staff are exhausted. How can we do this work without that kind of mental harm? Something has got to give. And in some ways, this is predictable, whether it was COVID or whether it was the enrollment cliff that everybody keeps talking about that's coming, right? And you just add all of these things together. I mean, the writing has been on the wall for a very long time that the kinds of ways we're engaging right now are not sustainable.
Yeah, yeah. There has to be a seismic kind of shift that takes place. Renee?
You know, I was thinking as well about the question that was posed for me, and one of the things that I made an active decision that I was going to do is that I was just going to be really explicit about certain expectations that I had, recognizing that they might be read through the lens of it being about some kind of personal, some personal kind of drive or need, or that it's not about the institution. And I was okay with that, So at some point I just said, I'm going to explicitly make sure that I always identify myself as a Black feminist, so that people, if they didn't understand what that meant, they had some sense of what that might imply, that I was always going to say that I was going to be very clear about the power of anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism within institutions as a foundational reality that we need to continually confront. And that I was also going to make sure that, colleagues, white colleagues, were clear on their role and responsibility in addressing that as well. And that however I did those three things, that those three things would have to be integral in how I show up in a space. And particularly once I was in, administrative leadership roles where I had some wherewithal to do that, I knew that I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do that. And, recognizing there may or may not work, but that to call the question repeatedly about why we're doing what we're doing, how are our actions having an impact? One of the things that I remember saying at my previous institution, in a public commentary that I provided around anti-Black racism and the need for our institution to be explicitly committed to becoming an anti-racist institution, is that we need to stop being surprised by the existence of bigotry in the United States. We really, let's stop being surprised. Let's stop, having to have moments of, public conversation, because it's just more of the same. And it's disingenuous and dishonest to say we didn't know. Maybe we didn't care, maybe it didn't matter to us, but to say that we're unaware is a questionable stance to take. So as an institution, if we're going to fundamentally presume that racism is real, that misogyny is real, that homophobia is real, and it's a part of where we work, then we automatically have to walk into every space, every conversation, recognizing that those things are being replicated. And as a sociologist that's, all about looking at how systems reproduce social inequities, I'm also using my analytical frames from my training to try to see what are the systems that are doing this. And then, bringing back to folks when they would say to me, well, we need you to do X, I would say, what have you done? What decisions have you made? Because you actually have opportunities where you sit that don't rely on me as dean and now as provost to enable you to do your work and to do your work through that framework. So I've had to really call that out, recognizing the risk as a Black woman and as an Afro-Latina, recognizing that how people are going to review it is going to be, oh, she's got an agenda, recognizing that folks are going to push even harder to resist because of who the person is who's communicating these things. And yet I will continue to do it. because I'm in a role where it is absolutely my obligation to call it out, and also to make sure that people see where they have some room to be part of that work, because it's all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Kalila?
Yeah, I'm thinking here, the last time that Jamal and I were on an in-person panel together, Professor Lonnie Guinier was on that panel with us. And she was talking about that experience that you can be as good as you need to be. You can be superior in every endeavor. And there will always be someone who will call your record to question. And the reality of being a human being is that you can be superior on 5 things, and it could be the one thing that someone points out that could have you question your whole being. We have to resist that, particularly in this moment. And I want to be clear, I grew up in Virginia. Few things surprise me when it comes to race and citizenship and ethnicity in this country. I grew up in a place called Lynchburg. I get it totally. I'm not surprised by the people who are consistently opposed to my presence as a Black woman in a space where they don't think I belong or they never envisioned me being. I can navigate with those folks because they're consistent and I see where you're coming from. The challenge often in higher education, particularly for administrators, are the people who speak the language and think that they know and think that they get it. So they can quote white fragility to you chapter and verse. They know the language of anti-racism and think because they know through study or theory that they then get to dictate what your experience and your approach should be. And that's a problem, because it means that if we are committed to the same things, how we get there and how we exhibit the humility to get out of the way is also important. And I think to both Jessica and Renee's point, higher education is at a reckoning right now, where we have to determine what is our purpose. When we have young people who are saying, I don't want to be saddled with large debt and not be sure how that will convert for me later in my life. When the demographics of who's going to college is changing and they still encounter curricula and faculty and administrators and staff who are opposed to their very existence. When alumni say, if you don't acknowledge the pain that I experienced on this campus, please don't call me and ask for a donation. Or when faculty say, I'm the only one or one of few, and now I get called on for every service expectation, and then it gets used against me when I'm being evaluated. Those are challenges for higher education that if we want to endure, and I'll be very clear, I love having a job. I love having a steady paycheck coming in. It is wonderful. If we want to continue to have a job, we have to get involved in those conversations and figure out how we're not just putting people into position to use them today and forget about them tomorrow because they get replaced by the next shiny idea.
And I also think, and that those are all great points. And I also would just add, I think there is an obligation of these associations, right? Higher ed associations, to also facilitate this conversation. We are now returning back to all of these in-person convenings. This should be an agenda item, I would argue, on for discussion and for us to really pick at and dissect as we're bringing all of these folks back together. So I hope my challenge today is that we facilitate that conversation at some of these meetings. Jessica?
Yeah, I just want to remind folks, and maybe I don't have to, maybe I'm speaking to the choir here, but the choir needs to practice sometimes too, right? So, I just want to say, this is why coming back in person is so hard for so many folks of color, because we have been able, myself included, to be in an office where I don't have to see that person who I know is going to roll their eyes, suck their teeth, assume I don't know what I'm talking about, and they report to me, right? Instead, I can block that view. Instead, they can block their video if they don't want to deal with me. And in so many ways, the virtual environment has made it a bit safer, frankly. All of the informal interactions that happen before and after meetings that are often uncomfortable for us, we have been able to avoid. Frankly, I talk to who I want to talk to when I am behind my Zoom screen. And so I think that's another piece of this. And so how do we make our in-person spaces, spaces that we want to come back to? And it can't just be rhetoric. It can't just be box checking. It can't just be, well, there's a person of color on this committee and therefore we're good, right? There has to be a fundamental rethinking about the purpose of what it is that we're doing. And I don't mean the big pieces that Kalila was talking about, although that is important. I mean in those everyday interactions. You know, I can't tell you how many faculty I have heard over time say, oh, well, students don't prioritize my class because of X, Y, and Z. And you know what? They are right. In the time of a pandemic, especially, your class, your paper may not be the most important thing in that student's day. Just like my deadline that I'm setting for my faculty or a dean may not be the most important thing. And we've, in an ironic kind of way, it feels like to me what we need to do is sort of triple down on improving our communication. And yet that's the thing I see breaking down more and more. We're communicating more by email, which means there's more room for misinterpretation. We are not seeing, 70% of communication is nonverbal. I can't see 70% of everybody's body here today. And so we are missing important clues. And then you add the sort of lack of civility that we're seeing in society as a whole, where talking about hard, difficult things that we know at the outset we will disagree about, we have forgotten. And so I just think this is a moment to really have our campuses, our institutions reinvest in how we build back our relationships with one another as we return to campus.
Oh, great points. Thank you so much. I want to get to some questions, but before we do that, I do have one last question that I want to ask you all, and that is this issue of racial trauma, right? And we've seen this in terms of what students are grappling with, what's happening in society in the broadest sense, and what they're coming to campus grappling with, and faculty and administrators. I was wondering, how are you all individually dealing with that racial trauma? Because there's also elements of self-care that you also have to protect your own self. And so I was wondering, what does that dynamic look like for each one of you as you're trying to help your students and your faculty work through all of what we've seen, particularly over the last couple of years? Renee, can I start with you?
I have to say that I didn't even realize how much I was internalizing of everything, just being a person in the world. And then on top of it, the particular things that students especially were experiencing day to day, just moving through space. And then what was happening within the United States and then globally. And I didn't know how much I was carrying that until one particular day when it was another incident involving, violence against another Black and brown body. And I came home and I had this moment where I fell apart, like literally dissembled in front of my family. And I was unable to actually do anything because it all just kind of came crashing in. And, so it was important. It was important because it reminded me that, the myth of the Black superwoman is real, and that I, as a human being, need space to deal with the things that I'm dealing with as a human. And that in my job, I was certainly expected to be available to everybody, to be the guide, to be the partner, to be the thinker. And there was no space for me as a woman of color experiencing what I was experiencing on my own. And so I think that's bad for our health. And we know the stories about the sort of health crisis that I think scholars of color, women of color in higher ed have been experiencing for a very long time. So this is not a new thing at all. But I think that was really, it was a wake up call for me. And I've said this to other folks, that no matter how much you love your job, your health and your personal well-being is always paramount, always, always, always. And so if you cannot figure out how to fix the situation you're in, make sure you're focusing on your health somehow. And so, and I mean that emotionally, spiritually, relationally, in every possible way. And so for me, it really was, I had to, figure out, how do I rebuild what I need within me to be able to do this work? And it really came through the ways I was connecting with my friends and being more honest about the challenges that I was facing or the things that I was going through with my colleagues who are in comparable positions. So I have one text chain that has been going for years that has been just incredible. So when I'm in a moment, I can be like, I got to share this with you. I just need to make sure that that I'm not misinterpreting this, or just someone who would talk me out of the moment, right? So that was really important. And I think the things that I love. So I really think that all of us, whatever that thing is. So for me, it's, music, and it's cooking for the people I care about, and, and art. So really recommitting myself to spending more time doing that. Collecting, Black artists that I love, and, really surrounding myself with the things that remind me of the value of my humanity in a way that sometimes the work can not recognize, all of which was really important for me to do, and maybe some version of that for other folks, because, if we're in this for the long haul, we really need to figure out, how do we, what's the sustenance that we need to be able to do this work?
Yeah. Kalila?
I'm nodding along, and I'm also taking notes like, oh, I should try that. Let's see if this works. The reality is that it is very isolating to be in higher ed administration, period. It is very isolating to be a person of color in administration, especially in a case where you may have come through faculty or you have been at that institution for a while and are making an adjustment. Because the people that you used to go to after a meeting, like, can you believe Renee said whatever? And here's Jessica again doing it. You can't do that anymore. And so figuring out, how do I maintain my sanity? How do I sort of check myself to make sure that whatever I'm dealing with isn't creating an obstacle with someone else? Where do you go? Who do you have those conversations with to be able to talk through, but sometimes to just laugh, because things seem so absolutely absurd. And so I've had to intentionally curate a village, a different kind of village, to be able to do that. Some people are also in administration at my university. So there's a person, if we're in a room and what's understood doesn't have to be spoken. And you can just nod your head and just say, okay, we get it. That's it. That's all you need. Maybe there's a person outside of your institution or network, an organization that you should build with because you need that space of support and communication. When I was negotiating this position, the first thing that I asked for was, funding to have a professional mentor and a professional coach. Because no matter how good you are, no matter how much leadership experience you've had in the past, this is a different kind of leadership set. And I wanted to have that opportunity to build and to learn more. The last thing that I'll say here in terms of how you navigate that, my favorite phrase is protect your peace. Be very clear about what you share and where you share it. And I'll say one more thing about that. Academia is very small. You never know who knows whom or how people are connected or where they're connected. And so if you are venting your experience on an open Facebook group, it's not that hard to figure out where you are or actually who you're talking about. And although it may feel good in the moment because you just need a release and you need other people to support, that can actually make things more complicated for you, as well as all of the legal HR kinds of things that we navigate as well. So creating that village, curating a space of people that you don't have to justify who you are or walk in with your title, but you can just be. That is what has been key for me and what I'm still continuing to work on, and always reminding myself therapy is a wonderful investment in your longevity.
Yeah, great points. Jessica?
I'm over here. Kalila just took me to church about 4 times. But I I want to say a few things. And I hope that people can hear it from my positionality and my intention. It has been an incredibly difficult several years. And the T word, therapy, especially in Latino, Hispanic, Latinx communities, is not seen as an option. Those are things that white people do. We have to get over that. We really do. This is something that I'm struggling with on my own, is just trying to find outlets for myself. And someone, several people over the years have continuously provided me with 2 suggestions. One is writing in a journal and the other is meditating. I am a New Yorker. These are not things we do. So I have to find something that works for me. And something that has been really simple that I have started doing lately is just doing body check-ins. And it takes about 30 seconds. And what I mean by that is I'm sitting maybe in between meetings, between Zoom calls, and I just sort of scan my body for where I am feeling tension. Sometimes you don't even realize that your shoulders are all the way up by your ears. And it just takes a moment of consciousness to go, oh, okay. There are days where I would leave the office and I was sore. And I didn't know why. And it was because I was holding all that tension with me all day long, in my jaw, in my upper back. And so the physicality of it manifests itself, right? And so paying attention to your body, not how you look, but how you feel physically. And I just try a couple times a day to physically release all that tension in my body. The other thing that I want to say, and this is the part where I'm hoping people do come along with me in my comments, is over the last several years, there has been a very particular sort of narrative around folks who look like me that I want to talk about for just a second. And lots of conversation about white passing. And we're talking about racial trauma. And so I need to address this point. There are so many assumptions that people make about a person's experience based on the way that they look, without understanding the content of those experiences. And I want to just make a point that there is a true and significant difference between being white passing, as if that is something a person is choosing to do, versus being white assumed. And I cannot help it if people are wrong. But what I can do is I can make sure that people know where I stand about who I am. And that is important, but it has also been, frankly, traumatizing. Imagine every time you walked into a room that people think you are somebody who you are not, thinking that it is okay for them to say certain things to you about a group that you belong to. Just last week, 2 weeks ago, actually, my 14-year-old was told by a little boy in her class, well, she's pretty clean for a Mexican. 14-year-olds. So imagine what that conversation looks like with people, educated people with PhDs. It's that, but just with more, SAT vocabulary, right? And so that is also traumatic, to constantly, repeatedly have to prove who you are to people. And what I want to say to folks that may be dealing with something similar is, you will never change anyone else's mind. Whether you are Black assumed, white assumed, etc., people are going to think what they think. And one of the things that has just been so important for me, for my family, for colleagues, is I have to know who I am, regardless of what they say. That doesn't make the trauma go away. It doesn't make the impact disappear. But it allows me to engage in this work from a place of strength, rather than a defensive position. And that's all I can control. I can only control how I respond. I've seen a bunch of questions in the chat around, well, what do you do if, white administrators don't see you and hear you. I can't control what they do. I never will. The more you try to do that, the more frustrated you will be. Do you see yourself? Are you saying what is truly in your heart and mind and what your scholarship or creative work pushes you to say? Are you acting and moving in spaces in ways that are authentic to who you are, that fill you? And if that is the case, protect that at all costs. And sometimes that means you have to move. Sometimes that means you have to leave a position. Sometimes that means you have to move away from family in order to do that. There are no easy, I wish I could say these are easy things for us to deal with as we process our trauma, but they are not. They are not easy. And they won't be, I don't think, in our lifetimes. These are going to be things that we continue to face and to battle with. And I don't have to be, and I'm saying this more for me, but I'm hoping that it resonates with someone. I don't have to be the most Cuban person in the room to know who I am. I don't have to prove that. I don't have to wear it on my sleeve. I don't have to come in my Cuban flag on my shirt. I can just be myself and know that that is enough. And I can tell you that for many of us, especially as we deal with imposter syndrome, especially as we are questioned about our actions and our positions are assumed, that will become more and more important, especially as you perhaps climb the ladder of leadership.
I want to get to, yes.
I'm sorry, I just have to say,
no.
Yes, 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 and yes. I mean, it is, when you finally have a sense of truly understanding that your self-worth isn't defined by those perspectives that you cannot control, that you cannot change, it's a moment of liberation. I mean, I made a decision to leave a job that I was in because I had a moment of clarity about their inability to understand what it meant for me as a Black woman to experience certain things. And I was like, oh, okay, now that I understand that, I know I can't be here anymore, exercising the kinds of action that you're looking for me without getting what I need in return. And I can't change you. The moral argument, the values argument, that doesn't work. So I'm going to go. And I did. And it was exactly the right thing to do because, as you were saying, when you walk in the room and people are going to make all sorts of assumptions about who and what you are, you can't control that. But when we have agency, we can exercise it. Not everyone has the same kind of agency. Not everyone has the same level of opportunity and choice. And that is a fact. But when you have it, you can exercise it. And that sort of expression of worth is the most profound thing that you can experience.
Yeah, we only have 2 more minutes, and this is a great conversation. But I think one question that I've read and that's come up really is, what are some of the next steps that folks can take? I mean, this session today was the start of hopefully a broader conversation that needs to take place. What can people read? Do you all have any just quick suggestions on what can be done next for those who are tuning in, sort of a call to action? Kalila?
I'm looking at some of the comments, like, can we do this weekly? I don't know about weekly, but I do think that these are conversations that need to happen regularly. These are connections. Jamal, you mentioned the existing professional associations. There needs to be an opportunity to network and for people to just be, but to also see perhaps you are tilling the soil for this season and this job, but it may be somewhere else where you need to build. And how do we position people to do that so they're not just thinking about how do I survive this job, but how do I create a life that I want to live? And I hope those are the next steps. And more than anything, I hope that people who are in these positions who are doubting themselves realize that they are not the only one, that we all experience this, but in many ways have been conditioned and socialized not to say anything because we're so used to always having to have our head on swivel. So thank you, Jamal, and thank you to Verse and Renee and Jessica. I always learn so much from the two of you.
Very, very good. Thank you. Anyone else want to quickly chime in? Got 30 seconds.
Who are you checking in on? Who are you checking in on? And who is checking in on you? And if the answer is no one, build your posse, build your team. They don't have to be at your institution. They don't even have to have the same job as you, but they can't be family. It needs to be someone else who's in higher ed, who will understand without you having to explain or justify why you are working in the summer. And why you are taking an email at 11:30 and why your provost is calling you at 7 a.m. while you're getting your kids ready, right? So start to actively build that posse of folks and, network. You need that network. Create your Vegas space, where you can say whatever you want and it stays in Vegas, whether it's crazy or not. Sometimes you need to speak the crazy because sometimes it's real, right? And you need someone to go, you know what, you're not crazy. That's really what just happened.
Yeah. Renee, any parting words?
Basically, I think we've covered what I would say, who are your people, intentional community, create the space where it doesn't exist. And I think looking at to others and checking in on them, because you want to model what you want for yourself as well. The networking thing is really important because and thinking about who are your mentors, who are the people that, and it doesn't have to be rank, it's just someone who has some wisdom that you benefit from and that you want to connect to, and be intentional about that, because I think that we sometimes forget that mentoring is a powerful thing. And then lastly, I think back to something Kalila said, if you're in a position to negotiate something for yourself and your job, negotiate the resources that you're going to need, negotiate the money to have a coach or a mentor, negotiate the money to be able to go to professional meetings where you can get that nurturing, negotiate the money that allows you to have the space and the grace to do the work that you need to do.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful learning experience for me, and I appreciate your time, your candor, and for helping us to build community today. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Wendy. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Watson, and all the panelists. Such a wonderful discussion. I just wanted to share just a few more details about Diverse, how you can learn more about us and some of our resources. Of course, you can go to our website, diverseeducation.com, to enhance your awareness, efforts, and engagement. We also offer various free newsletters, as you see there on your screen. If you're not a subscriber, just go to our website and click the subscribe button in the upper left-hand corner. Sign up for one of these free newsletters. Also subscribe to our magazine in digital and print. And then, of course, our Keep It Real Diverse game and workshops are just a great and fun way to start the conversation with students and faculty. Lastly, we do have our podcast series in the margins for timely discussions on topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. And again, just go to our website and click on podcasts in the upper toolbar to download these podcasts or go to any of these platforms. And again, thank you so much for joining today. Please stay tuned for other upcoming Diverse Talk Live webcasts. I know we have one coming up soon, I believe, so please watch out for that. And again, we just thank you very much for joining us and really appreciate the time and conversation with our panelists. Thank you so much. Have a great day.